We are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicenda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Prestige Class is a series we do where we sit down with somebody from the game design community whose work we followed for a long time, or in this situation have looked at from a distance but recently fallen in love with. And we talk with them about their design process, about the games they make, about their history of playing and making games, and see what lessons we can extract from that. Today we are talking with Greg Saunders from Fire Ruby Designs. And so Greg, rather than me try to memorize a bunch of things about you that you already know, why don't you tell people a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the games you design?
Okie dokie. So yeah, I'm Greg Saunders. I'm British. I'm from the UK. My kind of history, if you like, in gaming probably started in the 80s, the early 80s, with a bit of D&D that everybody was, dabbling in a little bit in those days. But then a lot of the kind of early Games Workshop games, which is things like, Call of Cthulhu and stuff like that, which they got across from other companies, but also Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and all of that kind of stuff that went along with that, and the war game that kind of followed in that as well. No, preceded that, I should say. And that was kind of my backdrop, really. So I came into gaming that way. I still collect pre-slaughter, as they call them, the very old school miniatures from back in the early days of Games Workshop, and scribble them away, and my daughters try and paint them when I stop them because I'm painting them. But that's kind of my backdrop. So yeah, I've been playing role-playing games ever since, really, on and off. I also play a lot of board games, and all sorts of different things. And then I guess I came into designing games probably in the 2000s, where I think most people who play games, you're always thinking to yourself, I could do something different here, or I don't like that, I'll do it like this. And then it's really a relatively small step from that to all of a sudden you're designing your own game. So it's been quite a long process, I would say. But yeah, I've designed, I'm trying to think now, probably six games in that time period, and the latest one is obviously Warlock and Warpstar. But yeah, that's kind of my background. So it's been a long time playing games.
Love it. And like I said, we were talking before we went live, but one of the questions that I asked that I think encapsulates a lot of what I'm also kind of excited to talk to you about. Like, I have for a long time been a fan of Troika. Troika is another British OSR system, and there's these terms that'll get thrown out, like nobody ever calls American OSR stuff American OSR, but there is definitely a term that gets thrown out of British OSR. And if you had to describe what you think British OSR means, what does that mean, or how does it compare and contrast with OSR resources from other places? Or even before that, let's just start with, how would you classify OSR?
Yeah, exactly. Obviously a contentious topic. I think a lot of people think of OSR as being related to old school Dungeons and Dragons. Absolutely. Like, if you look at old school Essentials or something like that, fantastic thing that is. It's relating back to a certain set of mechanics and a certain way of playing. To my mind, it's more just the kind of feeling of the games I played when I was much younger, when you didn't generally get a massive tome that was like 400 pages thick and with loads and loads of splat books or whatever that go with it. It was more self-contained and more kind of simple in that sense, and a bit more freedom, I think, in what you could do with it. So that's kind of what I think of as OSR. It's really just that kind of feeling, which is really hard to describe and a bit tenuous. And then the British side of it, again, I think a lot of the, you might call American OSR, if you wanted to call it that, is related a lot to Dungeons and Dragons, which is a very well-known thing that most people are very familiar with. I think the British side is influenced by the early games that came out over here, which were very obviously British, which is things like Fighting Fantasy, which obviously influenced Troika a lot, and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and the whole kind of Warhammer world, which is obviously a massive thing now, but at the time it was a relatively small thing. And that tends to be, I think, more grounded, more gritty than especially what D&D perhaps has become, if you like. Not that that's a better thing, it's just a different thing. It's just a different, perspective, but a kind of, you can't really say the word realistic when you're talking about fantasy role-playing games, but that kind of more about the little man and about, the drudgery of life and trying to fight your way through it rather than the heroic, kind of ideal, if you like. And I think that's what came through. If you read Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you have the famous one, the career class, Ratcatcher. That sums that up beautifully, what that is about. So you could start off as, and my character I played back in the day did start out as a rat catcher, with the small but vicious dog and all that kind of stuff. So just a very different kind of idea of what the game was kind of emulating, and I think as well a little bit with things like Fighting Fantasy, a bit of whimsy in there, a bit whimsical, and it's not too serious. And I think that's the other aspect as well, is a bit of humor, a bit of kind of black humor. Which again is a little bit different, not taking itself too seriously, I think, is the other thing. It's kind of that kind of like, so to me, that's kind of what it means when I think of a British old school role-playing game. I mean, you can say whatever you like, but when I think of Warhammer or something like that, to me, that's what I'm thinking of, that kind of thing. A bit of dark humor and a bit of gritty griminess.
Awesome. Well, Penny for a Tale says hello. Brandon Leon Game Beta says hello, and then Alex from Blackoath, who we're going to be talking about in a little bit, also is joining in and excited to watch. Thank everybody who's out there watching wherever you happen to be watching from. Brandon, by the way, we were talking about Passion earlier today with Aaron King and the way it impacted Patchwork World, so can't wait to get you on for one of these also too to talk about that. I've got a lot of people hopping in, lots of people very excited. So you said you've designed, 5 or 6 systems, and we talked a little bit about what British OSR, and one of the funny things I was talking about, one of the terms that came up, I asked on Twitter, I asked in a couple Facebook groups, like, how would other people design it? And, a lot of the same thing, high level of realism, less super heroism, way more grounded, way less, hey, we're fighting to become influential members of the kingdom, and hey, we're just fighting for moderately cheap beer fees at the end of the day, like the ability to sit at a pub and a tavern to survive and to live with our friends. But the other term that came up, which you couldn't decipher either, somebody, flying poo, like this concept of whether that's throwing shit or whether that is the concept of literal flying poo, I don't know, but this concept of there's this very human, gritty aspect to British OSR that, even as dark and as gritty as American OSR can be, it doesn't have that same kind of feel to it. And so, I played Troika for the first time a few weeks ago as a part of a Troika Fest event we did. I've read through Warlock now and absolutely fell in love with it. But if you were thinking about kind of like some of the moments from your own table, whether that's playing and running Warlock or some of your other games, or whether that's growing up, what are some of the things that you do in design to kind of ground yourself in that mindset? What are some of the ways that you approach that in the systems that you create that are British OSR?
Yeah, I think perhaps one way of thinking of that is every table I've sat at to play games, invariably there's a lot of laughing going on. That's just you're a group of friends getting together. There's a lot of table chat and a lot of laughter. And I think in those kind of games, it's almost like you kind of embrace that side of things, and it's a bit silly or whatever, a bit Monty Python or whatever some people tend to go. That kind of thing becomes kind of part of the game, if you like. And I think again, that's maybe something that defines that kind of idea. It's very easy to become very serious, especially when you're writing games and designing them. You're very serious because it's very serious and exciting, and heroic and whatever. But I think what I try to do with Warlock is to let that humour come into it a little bit, because that's, in my experience, is what it's like when you sit around the table with people especially if it's as it was when I was growing up, people I've been playing games with for a long time, the same people. Then that's part of what you're there for, is to have a chat with your friends and eat and drink and play games. So it's that kind of thing, I suppose.
So like a lot of the tones we were talking about are like these very gritty, heavy things. How, like within your writing process, is it more in like the lore and the world building side of things that you're trying to create like how do you create opportunities for that type of humor, like around the table with your designs, do you feel like?
Yeah, I think some of that comes into the kind of world building a little bit in this. It's in Warlock you have those careers, and there's a little bit of flavour that goes in. A couple of little tables you roll on to give yourself, and again, it's just little kind of hopefully vaguely humorous, snarky comments that are in those tables that just give you some kind of little bit of information about your character. I think that's one thing to me that defines these kind of old school games, and I think that's regardless of whether if you start the D&D bent or whatever it is there's not that much detail. It's all very over big overview, and the setting in Warlock's like that. There's not a huge amount of detail. There's no big timeline or anything like that. It's more just trying to get across in the writing a little bit of the feeling of what it's supposed to be about, and then it's up to people to come up with their own stuff, because that's the cool stuff that people come up with. Yeah. Rather than some massive book with a lot of detailed setting in there. I think it's certainly in my experience, a big book with a lot of setting, it's quite hard to keep up maybe a little bit of humor in there, or a bit of a lighter touch in that, because it's such a dense thing. So I think Troika is a perfect example where there's no setting apart from those little bits of snippets of text that go with the character classes. That's it. That's pretty much the setting. But there's so much in there. You get so much out of reading that paragraph. You don't need a big book with half a ton of detail in there. You just need those little bits, and that just tells you all you need to know about what that game is. And so that's the idea with Warlock as well, is to just have a little bit to spark the imagination, but not define everything for. So I guess that's the change. Whereas my previous games I've written are much a bit more involved, a bit more story game-ish kind of thing. A different kind of thing, so they tend to be mechanically more involved as well. So this Warlock came out. If I just waffle, because I'll be waffling, but Warlock came out really because I wanted to play Cubicle 7 re-released Warhammer, and they re-released the Enemy Within campaign, which I played when I was a kid, and I loved it, and that was one of my fondest memories of gaming, was playing through at least the first 3 or 4 parts of that campaign. I just loved it. It was awesome. And then it came out again, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to play this again with the people I play with now, because it's a different group of people. And they'd never played it. So brilliant. And then it was again, not to say something terrible at other people's games, but the current version of Warhammer is just not my kind of game. And that's a failing on my behalf, because I've got no memory basically. So I'm terrible at remembering rules. So I was thinking I need a rules-like game that I can use to play this game, to play this campaign, and that's how Warlock started. What can I do to capture the feeling of that kind of Warhammer feeling, but in something very rules-like that's really easy to remember, that I'm going to be able to GM nicely without my brain exploding.
Yeah, I love that. Alan Barr was posted up a picture the other day from Gallant Knight Games. There as an adaptation of classic Dungeons and Dragons modules now for 5e. There's somebody who's porting a lot of them over. It may be Goodman. I'm not sure.
It is Goodman.
Is it Goodman? Okay. But that's just such an interesting concept, because my big thing is, like, I sit down with those modules and I read them and I'm like, I would never want to play these in 5th edition, right? I would only want to play these with a much lighter, much more open, because that's not what they were designed for. And even though the core rules are the same, which I would say old Warhammer Fantasy and modern Warhammer Fantasy is not the case. The line between D&D and 5th edition is I think way clearer, maybe with a short stop off for 4th edition. And I would still never want to play that. I would always want to pick up something that really grabbed, okay, what's the system that's going to be the most fun to play this setting in? And that's not to say that there's one right one for every single one, but I love that was a way that began the genesis for you. And I think, having read through Warlock, having played Troika, and even having talked to people who are fans of those who have not played them, when I asked them, like, hey, why haven't you played them? They're like, I just don't know how I would start. They know how to create the character. They know how to make it. They know how they can look at the adventures and have kind of an idea of what they do. But then they sit there and they're like, well, I don't know exactly what the setting is. And whereas in other, like in D&D, that rarely ever bothers people. Like they don't ask the question, what do I do? But I think the fact that, like if we looked at the bounty hunter, right, class, there's 2 things you roll for. One person you have caught and one person you're searching for, right? So like there's like
Yeah.
your sister, don't ask. But now we know like your sister had to be caught for some reason. You had to catch your sister. That matters.
Yeah.
Will that come up again? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And like, you know, another one would be like the lover of just a jilted noble. Well, now we know that just the jilted noble exists. We know that they have a lover. We know that you're on the hunt for them. And that's a hook right there that maybe is creating their story. And when you combine 4 or 5 of those and you say, hey, we've got to all guard a cart that's going over here. Or you say, hey, we've all got to, like, just the thing that takes us from point A to point B, all of a sudden you have all these little pieces of the world that you've got tagged in on. And by the sheer fact that they exist, they become important, which is exactly what Troika does, exactly what Warlock does. I think a lot of old school systems actually do that. I think the cool thing about the British sensibility from my standpoint, or at least Warlock, Troika, and a couple other games, is the fact that there is nothing else. I mean, even though there's plenty, like the cool thing about Warlock, you've got so much additional content. There's plenty of locations. There's plenty of ideas. There's plenty of things you could be doing in tons of expanded books that you've done, a lot of which have been put together in the Black Edition. But it is the openness of it. And for whatever reason, for a lot of people, that openness in a role-playing setting is somehow intimidating for them. And for me, it's my favorite. Like, that's all I want. And, you know, PBTA systems basically focus on that. They're like, hey, like, draw a map and leave holes. And that's what Warlock and a lot of OSR systems do. And especially in the British sensibility is like, we've just given you a couple pieces, go fill in everything else. But then people are like, but I don't know how to do that. So for somebody who may be approaching Warlock for the first time, like, what's your advice, or how is the game itself maybe written in a way that helps them start to navigate some of those pieces?
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing in fantasy games, generally speaking, there's kind of a shared, especially obviously in the Western part of the world, a shared kind of vision of what, you know, if you say orc to somebody who's got some vague interest in role playing, they know what you're talking about. It might not be the same orc, but it's an orc. So, you know, we're all kind of, we have that in common in all of these kind of games, even though there aren't orcs in Warlock, but there you go. I think it's one of those things that it just suits different kinds of people. I think the openness and is kind of, I mean, to be honest, obviously it's like everybody who writes role-playing games for a hobby. This is what I'm doing. You know, it's not my living to write these games. It's you're writing what you would like to play. That's what you're doing. You're putting together something that you think would be cool because I would like to play this game, or I do play this game. So it kind of appeals to those kind of people. I think a lot of the OSR games are like that. They're built for people who were around a long time ago, like me, and you know, have a long history of playing games, and they don't find that intimidating. But I understand, you know, obviously new people coming in, it's a completely different world because you've got one massive book with lots of detail and lots of history and a big adventure with, you know, hundreds of pages long, and then you've got another book which is like tiny, like, again, Troika is the classic example, tiny little book, and it's just like, it could be a bit mind-blowing to see where you go from there. I think you just have to embrace that kind of concept, that there's no right or wrong. You're not gonna kind of, you know, make a mistake in the world that you're creating at the table, because there is no mistake. There is nothing. You know, it's all in your imagination. And I've said that to people before who've said, you know, can I change this rule or something, or I would like to do this. It's like, you know, you bought the game. As soon as you bought the thing, it's your thing. You can do what you like with it. You can hack it to pieces and add whatever bits you like. It's entirely yours. So I think people, I mean, I would just suggest that people just kind of relax into it. And the idea of those little stories is to give you just some little clues, so you're not just a bounty hunter and that's it, but you've got something to hang your hat on at the early part of the game that gives you something you can talk about, or that you can say that you did, or the games master can introduce some element of that again, like you meet your sister or whatever the heck, you know, just something that it gives you something to work with. And that's the thing, I think, especially with rules like games, you know, there isn't a huge amount of detail, so you have to be very try and cram in as much inspiration as you can into a short number of pages. And I think that, you know, the best example of that I've come across is Merkborg, if I pronounced that correctly.
You did. You did an excellent. You put the hard U on there. I was impressed.
I work for a Swedish company, so I should do. But 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 that, you know, is a, if you could write the rules of that game out on a page of A4, you know, there's not a lot to it. But the book, it just drips, you know, drips kind of a feeling and an atmosphere. And that you see that, I think, in the explosion of stuff that people have done for that people just get what that's about. There's hardly any detail in it, you know, in the book of the setting. You know, there's a page with a map and a few comments about a few places, but it's, people just pick up on the vibe that it gives off, and then you can just go with it. And I think that's the idea of that, to me anyway, those kind of games. It's like a big inspirational springboard, hopefully, to create your own world without feeling, because those, you know, those really detailed settings, some people love them and some people don't, because a lot of the time, you know, that's what you used to hear a lot about the Lord of the Rings. You know, I can't play in this setting because what if I get it wrong? What if I do something that's not canon anymore? And, you know, and it could all go horribly wrong. So people get nervous about that. So it's,
yeah, I feel like
horses for courses. Yeah,
I feel like the first thing people do when they sit down with a canon intensive book is sit down and say, what do I want to change? Right? Like no one ever sits down, reads through it and think, oh, this is exactly how I want to do every part of this. Right? Because I think it's part like our own desire as people, because as soon as you're playing, you're designing, right? Like as soon as, like, we're creating toolkits for other people to sit down and have their game with when we're designing. And so the reality is, like, they're going to take something from that or add things to it or fuse this piece over or move this part of the world here or whatever. And like, that's great. And there are, you know, like, so if you give people a heavy cannon, they're like, I want to change it. If you give people a very light cannon, they're like, oh, but now I want more. It's like, great, but do the exact thing you would do if it was heavy cannon. Add in what you want, do the things that you're looking for. And I love that. If you're watching right now, if you've got questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. It could be about Warlock. It could be about any of Greg's other games. It could be about OSR, whatever questions you have about design or anything else. Feel free to type them into the chat pretty much wherever you're watching. I should see him. If I don't, hop over to Twitch or YouTube and we'll see him there. But with that said, you know, you have a couple different designs that you've done. It's not just Warlock, but I do want to mention real quick before we hop over to some of those other ones. You know, we do have the Black Edition. Like, I did get this in exchange for absolutely nothing. Alex did send me this this phenomenal copy. Alex from Blackoath sent me this and some other great stuff. Incredibly thankful to get a copy. I was looking at it for like weeks, and then Alex and I happened to message each other the same day about a few different things, which is why we ended up talking together. But tell me about doing the Black Edition. You have a number of different titles that are available. I'm actually going to show people on Drive-Thru RPG some of the large amount of, that's just my Facebook, that's not Drive-Thru RPG. There's plenty of Warlock titles out there, right, that are available on Drive-Thru RPG. You can go get them right now, along with your other games from Fire Ruby Designs. But y'all decided to do the Black Edition. Tell me a little bit about the Black Edition specifically. Even though people can't get it, we're just going to rub it in their faces that, you know, I have a copy, you have a copy, some other people have copies. Maybe there will be more copies in the future. But what was the decision to do the Black Edition, and what are some of the things you were seeking to achieve with it?
So, I take no credit for the Black Edition. That was all Alex. So he contacted me and said, I would really love to do a nice edition of this book, because the versions I do, they're all drive-through pod, you know, print on demand. Which works perfectly for me. You know, I don't have to carry any stock or send things to people. That which wouldn't be good. You don't want me doing logistics. That would be very bad. So that's how I produce content and how I publish. And then Alex contacted me and said, "Yeah, would you be interested in collaborating on this deluxe edition?" And we had a few discussions backwards and forwards. And he showed me his Disciples of Bonus Shadow game. And the nice edition he'd done of that. It's like, that looks fantastic. And again, I think like most people into gaming, we all collect artifacts. We like things, you know, everyone likes a shiny book. So I was on board. And then we looked at the content, because Warlock, there's not, you know, it's not a long book. There's not a huge amount in there. So we said, well, we know what else could we put in there as well. So there's the Kingdom supplement in there, which is the setting, if you like. Which really came out of, in Warlock, it mentions lots of places. It just mentions, like, Pomperberg, just pops up as a name, but it's nothing else about that. And I got asked by a lot of people, you know, is there a setting? Are you going to do a setting? So, okay, I'll do a setting. So I did Kingdom, and then the Black Edition contains both of those and a few other bits and pieces from the compendiums, which are probably useful rules to kind of go along with it to make a nice set. And yeah, we put that together. Alex did all the hard work. I just said yes and no occasionally. But no, I didn't say no. I just said yes. We got some art sorted out from Carlos Castillo, if I pronounce his name correctly. That's one problem when you work with people that you kind of meet online. You never know how to pronounce any of their names. But anyway, but yeah, so Alex did that. And, you know, he did all the real work of sending all the copies out to everybody, which is a big job. But that's how it came to be. And it's beautiful. Yeah. I'm really happy with it. It looks fantastic.
Yeah, Alex.
So, yeah.
Blackoath. If you haven't checked out Blackoath yet, I just popped some of the issues from the site up. Like Alex was kind enough to send me like Disciples of Bone and Shadow, also too, same type of thick one, as well as this version of it also too. We'll be talking to Alec later on, either this month or early next month also too. Very, very excited about it. Penny for a Tale is very excited about this. The whole thing, yeah. Warlock is amazing, but apparently Penny for a Tale is also a huge fan of Summerland, which I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to look at yet, other than saw that you had designed it also when I was looking through. Tell us a little bit about Summerland. Penny for a Tale wants me to very clearly tell you that they are your biggest fan. That Summerland is their jam. I'll go ahead and read to you the messages. Also, Summerland, such majestic facial hair. Summerland, my jam. I'm really interested in this game. Gimme. Greg, I'm your biggest fan. Biggest fan. Tell him Summerland is my jam. And then he also says at the bottom, but not in a creepy way.
Just careful to point that out, yeah.
But tell me about Summerland.
So Summerland is probably it's not quite the first game, but it's the first decent game I made, should we say. But it's a kind of story game. The original edition had a different set of rules, but the second edition, which is the one that most people know, works on the Open D6 system, because that's a good little game engine. But it's a very different kind of game. It's a post-apocalyptic game where essentially we all went to bed. You know, we went to sleep one day, and when we woke up, the whole world had been covered by a huge forest, which we've got called the Sea of Leaves. So everything was covered in a forest. So all the buildings, you know, all the roads, everything, the world became this forest. And then you end up with these small pockets of humanity, because at the same time, there was this thing called the Call, which is basically like a kind of siren song that draws people into the woods, and then they disappear. And you get the people who are called the Wild, who are basically kind of feral people. And it's a long time actually since I wrote that game, so I'm trying to remember it. But what you play as characters are drifters, who are people who can move between these settlements. And the reason that is because you have had, again, this is very different to Warlock. We're talking a very story gamey aspect here. You've had some kind of trauma in your past. Some thing has happened to you that has basically hardened you to this thing called the Call. And then what happens in the game is the people in settlements are kind of safe from the Call, but you can't really traverse the forest without this being a problem. So the drifters do it for you. And the game, again, it has a very, that kind of idea where mechanically there's a goal to the game, which is to resolve your trauma and be accepted into a community. Because they won't accept you in because of this thing that's happened to you, basically. And then in the game, you can evoke your trauma to help you do things, and that gives you an opportunity to kind of heal it a little bit. But one of the things that's interesting about that idea, and the same thing in Exilium actually, in a science fiction setting, is you don't define what the trauma is at the start. You don't write that down. You maybe, I think, if I remember, you might write one sentence, but basically every time you try and invoke it, you say something more about what happened. So it might be that my sister died, and then next time when you're, I don't know, trying to escape or trying to pull your comrade out of a burning building, for example, you could evoke your trauma. It gives you a mechanical bonus, and you could say, "This happened to my sister. I couldn't save my sister, and that's why this is important to me." And that gives you the bonus, and you kind of reveal more about yourself by going through this process. And I've actually, I mean, to be honest, it sounds really daft because it's a role-playing game that I just dreamt up. But I've had people contact me and say it's a really interesting idea around what is a very difficult subject. The kind of mental trauma. It's not an easy thing, and it kind of tries to touch on that in a hopefully respectful kind of way. But yeah, I mean, that was my first game that was popular, and that's been out for a long time. And when it first came out, it was quite a popular game. And then the other games I've written in a similar vein is Exilium, which is a similar kind of thing in a science fiction setting, where the tagline was, you were a god, you committed a crime, and now you must pay. That sounds really pretentious. Blimey, how pretentious. But no, the idea is you were some kind of post-human, you did something wrong, you got kicked out, and now you're in like mundane reality. And you're doing missions for this thing that's asking you to do stuff. And again, you reveal parts of what you did, basically, what this crime was and what the place was that you left when you got kicked out. So again, you reveal more of what you're doing. So those games are quite linked. And then Esoterica is like a game of modern occult horror, a bit like Unknown Armies, that kind of vibe. But in it, you play an adept. You play someone who's essentially in a cult, trying to ascend, trying to pass beyond the world into some other place. And you do that by exercising essentially your magical powers. But when you do that, you open yourself up to corruption. And the only way to get rid of corruption is to find magical artifacts which kind of absorb it, essentially. That's the general gist. They're owned by other people trying to do the same thing. So that's kind of where the fight is. You're against all these other people trying to ascend. And again, what you ascend to, where you go, isn't defined. That's for you to define as you play the game. So anyway,
that's interesting because I'll pull up on themes of like of a blended experience of good and bad. I won't even say good and evil necessarily, but like and accessing community or something unknown, right? So like some of those are literally like, how do you become part of this community and not having to be a drifter, and other ones, how do you work your way back into society? The other ones, how do you work your way into this higher level of existence? And it's interesting to like see that theme running through your books. I want to talk about Golgotha in a second, but tell me about Warp Star, because you said that's one of the other games you're really well known for. So tell me a little bit about Warp Star.
Well, Warp Star is essentially a science fiction version of Warlock. And again, it's the guy who I work with has worked with me on the covers. Mustafa Bakir is very well known for doing a certain style of art. It's fantastic. Again,
Mustafa also did Mustafa do some of the map pieces also too for Warlock?
He did the world map, if you like. Yeah. Not the city map, but the world map. And he did not all of the covers, but a lot of the covers Mustafa did. And he's very much into that kind of early Warhammer world, if you like, that vibe. But yeah, he asked me, are we going to do a science fiction version of this? Because again, it would have worked really well, and kind of emulating 40K, that kind of thing. And that's what Warp Star is essentially. It's a similar game. It's just adapted for science fiction with a few changes to the rules. There's a bit more setting, because whereas in fantasy games, most of the time there's an implied setting or an implied reality of, dragons and orcs and goblins, and you can say goblin to someone or elf, and we all have a reasonable picture of what that is. In science fiction, you have to define things a little bit more, because obviously science fiction is a whole different, there's a million different types of science fiction. But that's what Warp Star is. So that came out after Warlock, and I've been producing stuff for that as well. So that's just a similar thing. Golgotha is a different kind of game. Golgotha uses the Black Hack system, if you've come across that, which you probably have. And that is essentially like a dungeon crawl in space type game. So in the setting, that's got a much more defined setting. There's the human sphere is where humanity lives in space, obviously. And there are two big alien nations, if you like, the Shells and the Erics, if I remember what I call them. That are they're fighting this thing called the Ever War, because it's gone on forever. But dotted around on the edge of their space are these things called Golgotha, which are basically ruined structures from the distant past, you know, installations, that kind of thing. And what you do in that game is you're essentially sent to these places by people called the overseers, or aliens called the overseers, who help the human sphere run, to collect artifacts. And so essentially it's like a dungeon crawling game in space, with a few of the kind of black hack mechanisms. Like there's a timer essentially when you get there, because you're invading the space of these two alien races that are at war. There's like a timer that ticks down as you explore. So that was the idea behind that one.
That's got some good, strong, like Mass Effect vibes also too, like as a modern touchstone. Like,
I'll tell you what book I've been reading that gave me that real. Have you read Revenger by Alistair Reynolds?
No.
So in that one, they're doing a similar thing. They're exploring these things called baubles, which are essentially these stations in space, if you like, and they're like a pirate crew in space investigating. I mean, Alistair Reynolds, hard sci-fi kind of thing. Really good, but yeah, that's the vibe, that kind of feeling, and the black hack system's a great system. So my previous games, really, I'd used other people's systems, because I was trying, I suppose you could say, I was trying to tell a certain story, and it didn't necessarily matter which system you used as long as it worked for what you were trying to say. Whereas Warlock was more about coming up with a system that would work for what I wanted it to do. So it was a different kind of approach, I guess.
Awesome. RPG Brainstorm says the Brazilian public is getting to know more deeply the British style of OSR, and Warlock is undoubtedly our main reference at the moment. And so he says, congratulations on the work, Tony and Greg. It was all Greg. I'm just talking to Greg about it. And so, I've seen a lot of my Brazilian OSR friends were some of the first people who I saw pick up Warlock and start talking about how much they loved it and put it on my radar. So that does not surprise me at all. So no, like I said, it's been such a thrilling thing to kind of just get to sit and check out. Like, you see these kind of threads of design that work their way through. You know, there are so many here in the States, so many different hacks out for retro clones. So there's, obviously OSE, black hack, white hack, the blue hack, the rad hack, as well as any other number of BX hacks that are out there. And, every once in a while you'll see these really kind of crystalline and interesting things like Errant, which is an OSR system by Ava Islam. It's absolutely phenomenal and pulls on some of those tropes, but draws very different procedures. And the British school of OSR, Troika, Warlock, some of the other more classic ones are looking at things in a very different way. I love getting to kind of explore, like, what is the meeting of open spaces between OSR and indie design, because they're both obviously a reaction to the highly canoned, like, very well, let's maybe overly lored modern role-playing systems that we'll see, where it's like all these hyper-defined locations and things, which can be helpful, but may not match my setting. And this is, the opposite end of that, saying, like, how do we sit down and tell a great story with a very minimal but intentional framework? And it's been absolutely amazing to get to just, like I said, explore Warlock. The art, Carlos did a great job with the art. Mustafa did a great job with the art. It's an absolutely gorgeous game, both in its original iteration, but especially in the new Black Edition, which Alex said, pretty sure you'll do a repeat soon. So I'll just say that it's in the chat. There's some great things about there. I'm going to ask you this question. Like, what are some games that are not necessarily your own that you always get excited to sit down and play, or that you wanted to try but haven't had a chance to play yet?
Wow.
And for those of you out there watching right now, while Greg's thinking, I'll vamp for a second. If you have any questions, we're coming up in the close of our time together. Go ahead and type them into the chat. Could be big, could be small, could be about, Greg's life. No politics, no religion, anything like that, but just anything related to game design you want to toss in there. Feel free to. Greg, what are some of the games you're hoping to get to your table more soon, or that you love to get to the table when you get a chance?
I mean, so I probably, like a lot of people who buy role-playing games, I have a vast number of games, or I've had a vast number of games, because I tend to buy them and sell them and all that kind of stuff. And I don't play anywhere near as many as I possibly could play that I have. I mean, the last game I bought, which I thought was really cool, was the new Mech Warrior Destiny, which is, again, a kind of rules, because Battletech is not rules light, but that is a rules light iteration of that universe. And again, really interesting game. I'd really like to play that. probably the last games I have played has been Merkborg, which again I love. But I mean, if you want to go real old school, my favourite game of all time was Skyrealms of Jurun, if you've ever come across that, which is very, very old school, 80s. Just look it up online because the art is just mind blowing. It's a guy who ended up, I think his name's Miles Teeves, and he ended up working in Hollywood doing special effects and designing monsters. And his art is just beyond anything. And that was the first game I looked at where it was so different to everything else. It was the world that was imagined of that game is just amazing. And like anyone who's ever played that game and loves it, we all dream of another edition, which will never ever happen because the rules weren't great. That's to be fair.
what was the name of it again?
Skyrealms of Jurun.
I am going to look it up. Yeah, people.
Look it up.
Brandon's like, what? Brandon says, "Oh my God, throwback." Penny for a Tale says, "I've not heard of this, but I'm not an old school gamer." But Penny for a Tale, listening to you talk about how much you love OSR stuff and how excited you are about other things, maybe you are a closet OSR gamer who just doesn't know it. I'll be super excited to check it out. Yeah, I think that's the thing with a lot of old stuff, like great art, great setting. Were the rules great or not? Like, who knows? You know, like, but then it's also like, what do you mine from that? Which Penny for a Tale had a great question, which is, how do you feel about your games looking back at them? Are there any parts where you pull it back and you're reading through and you're like, oh, that was a clever bit of design there, or parts that you look at and you think the opposite? Man, what was I thinking when I wrote that down?
No, not necessarily. I think they're very different kind of games, and I think it's interesting how the kind of what's popular at the time, or if you like, the way people are thinking. I think in the kind of time when I wrote Summerland, it was all about system and about designing clever mechanical things that kind of enhanced the system, enhanced the setting, if you like, and really keyed into how the setting worked. And that was the thing with a lot of, you know, story games. If you ever went to that forum, it was a lot of mechanical design about how you could make, you know, they used to say system matters, you know, tie it all together. And I think what's interesting in the OSR thing, if you like, is it's gone back to the other way of working, which is as long as we get a rough idea what we're doing, we'll wing the rest of it. That's, you know, basically what, you know, the whole, was it rulings, not rules, and all that kind of thing. It's like, I just need a framework of things to hang my hat on, and the rest of it I can just go with. I look back on my older games, and no, I'm quite pleased with them. To be fair, the very early games I look back on, I think maybe not, but most of the ones that I'm probably slightly better known for, I'm quite happy with how they came out. They're very different in how they play. The earlier games, those system-based ones, they require long-term play to really make them work because of there's a mechanical kind of thing that goes on in the game, and I suppose if I look back now, it's my taste changed just in the fact of, you know, I've got kids and a job and 2 dogs, so I have no time for these kind of, you know, very long and you know, and I guess, you know, in some ways when I look at a massive setting like something for Call of Duty, you look at a campaign and it's just awesome. And you look at it and it's amazing. And so I just look at it, I think I'd love to play it. I'll never have the time to play that game until I retire, maybe. And my kids have gone to university or whatever. So I think to my world, the kind of OSR idea of Warlock, how that works is something that's easy to pick up and just play a game or two. And then it doesn't matter if you don't, you know, play a massive campaign. Great if you do, but you don't have to. It doesn't need that. So yeah, but I think like most people, I buy games to read. So that's probably the biggest thing. The games that I keep are ones I really enjoyed reading. They're nicely written. They're not written like a textbook or a manual. It's enjoyable to read it because, you know, the reality is I don't play half the games I own because I've got.
You played half the games you own? That's insane. Nuts. Entire conceit of this channel was like, hey, here's an excuse to at least one-shot all of these games.
Yeah, there you go.
And so what? Two things real quick. I noticed that you do something that I think is great for designers. You have a few different games you've created, and you typically create numerous numerous books that support that core game. A lot of designers are just, they're going to produce this game this month, and then in a couple months they're going to put this game out, or in a year and a half later they put out this game. I really love that you take time to spend a lot of time getting more content out for your game. I don't know that I have a question to follow that up with. I just wanted to note it.
I can make a comment on that. I mean, to be fair, my early games, I was very much the producer game. That was pretty much it. There's two things that happen with Warlock. One is I deliberately designed it to be. It's easy when you write settings and things to constrain everything and build more and more and kind of pull it in. That makes it hard then to expand it later. So Warlock, I deliberately left it really open. As I say, in the core book, it mentions places just in those tables. You met somebody on the road to Pomperberg, and that's all it says. And then, so there's room to do things with that. But also, I mean, to be fair, I've had lots of people asking me for stuff, and it's just at the moment, I take that same thing. I think that's Phil Reed said in your other interview. It's while I enjoy doing it, I'll keep doing it, and people enjoy reading what I'm doing. So it's a win-win, and it's really fun and interesting to write the supplements for it. And I've had other people write stuff for it as well, which is absolutely awesome. That somebody else thinks it's fun enough to write stuff for, which is brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I'm really enjoying it, and it's there's more and more stuff coming out left, right, and centre. Awesome. I think lockdown helped as well,
Yeah.
Nothing else to do.
BB over on YouTube once says, Greg, will we see a black edition of something like Warp Star?
Who knows, but maybe.
People can't comment, but I will say that that Alec did say, ask about Warp Star. So who knows? Who knows what's in the card?
Yeah, all I'll say is I'm game. So if Alex is up for it, maybe.
There we go. And then you just mentioned a second ago, and it was a question that I was going to ask. You're open to people doing stuff with the Warlock and Warp Star system? If people want to create adventures, job lists, other things like that, what if they want to do that kind of stuff? How do they go about that? Is it
absolutely?
Yeah.
So I've had some adventures written by Eric Brimston and Jonathan Hicks, and I'm very hopefully easy to work with in this regard. I'm pretty easy with whatever people do. As I like to keep them as hardback books, so as long as they're of a length that I can use. But I would say the compendiums have got loads of stuff that people have contributed, and the best place to do that is on the Discord. On our Discord channel, there's a big chat there, and people just throw stuff up, and if it's cool, I ask them if I can nick it and stick it in a book and write their name on the side. And then people have actually, as I say, written like proper big adventures, or one of the books called Three's Company is 3 separate adventures, and we essentially share the glory that comes from that. But I'm really open to anyone who wants to contribute anything, and as long as it kind of fits with the vibe. I'm not, there's no, as I say, there's no real canon to upset. It doesn't have to be fit to some kind of truth, as they say. So easy on that regard. But the Discord is the place, my Discord channel, and I'll maybe post a link to that somewhere so you can see.
If you shoot it to me, we'll get it attached to this video for later. We can tweet it out.
Absolutely,
also for people who are interested. No, like I said, it's been absolutely exciting to sit down and explore it. I do think one of the great things for both Warlock, Troika, which that would include Warp Star and some other things, is the clarity and simplicity of design lead themselves to iterative writing. Like, I could sit down and write out, if I'm like, I want this job to exist, well, it's not hard to write that job. Like, I know that I've got to write the paragraph of evocative text, pick the skill levels at a certain amount, come up with a couple of D6 tables and some starting gear, and I've got it. Like, that's what you have to do to create the job, and you don't have to worry about, is it balanced? Is it going to do any of these other things? Because for one thing, it's not a high consideration, but it's also one of those things where you know what the pattern is, and that makes it really easy to sit down and just write it. And so
absolutely. I mean, just to say that, I mean, it's like the core system is you roll a d20, you add your skill, and you've got to get 20. That's the core rule. And I've had people before ask me, about difficulty levels and all that kind of thing. But the idea of the kind of design was that you can easily have any of that. You can do whatever you like. You could do the advantage disadvantage thing. You could do pluses and negative modifiers. You could do funky dice. Instead of rolling a d20, you roll a d16 if you want. The idea was to make it hackable, so people could basically add on whatever they fancied, and you wouldn't break anything because there's not really anything to break. Whereas, you know, the Warhammer, we mentioned it right at the start, the 4th edition, very much lots of intertwining things, very clever. But if you change something, you change everything else as well. And I was trying to get away from anything like that, where there was some kind of, you know, balance. I think the other thing, if you want people to be creative with what you've done, you have to make it as easy to use as possible. So you look at some games where the stat block is really complicated, and it's just a barrier for other people's creativity when they look at that and think, oh, I've got to make all that work and it's got to be balanced and everything else. So none of that.
Yeah, stuff. I also love, GURPS, which is the system I cut my teeth on, has 2 rules that I think are the most important. One is in the GM, one is in the player's guide. One amounts to, as a GM, your job is, your primary job is for everybody to have fun. But in the basic player manual, the core rule I think is the most important that people always miss about GURPS is when in doubt, roll and shout, right? Like when you don't know what should happen, roll some dice, like shout about what you think should be the case because of it, resolve it, and move forward. And I think as complex as that system is, you also have one in here that's, like if you don't know what to do, roll a d20, half of the results are good, half of the results are bad, like resolve it and move forward. Those types of clarifying rules are good because it says no matter how complex, no matter how simple the system is, if something comes up and you don't know, here's what you do. And I think that's just a smart thing to make sure you're dropping in any system you create.
It's like they say, it doesn't matter what the rule book says, as long as you're all having fun, then you're playing it right. Yeah. It doesn't matter if page 163 just says what you just did is wrong. Who cares? Right. As long as you're having fun.
Well, Greg, at some point in the future, I'd love to get you back on, maybe this summer, maybe later on in the year, to maybe play some Warlock or some Summerland on an actual play if we can figure out some time to do that. I bet you if we play Summerland, Penny for a Tail will come back and play with us. We just streamed their upcoming game, Necrobiotic, which is a very, very cool setting last Saturday. I don't even know. Time doesn't exist anymore. And but would love to come back, have you on, play some of your games with you, and get a chance to share them with people. Also, if people want to find out more information about you, the work you do, what's the best place for them to go look? Is it the Discord?
The Discord is if you want to speak to me, then that's the place I'll be hanging out most of the time. I've got a website as well, firerubydesigns.co.uk. That just basically shows the games that we've got. And then on Drive-Thru you can see all them as well. But there's a Facebook group as well, and I've got a Facebook page. So either of those work really. Any of those, Facebook or Discord, if you want to have some interaction.
Right. And if you're going to look on Drive-Thru RPG, search Fire Rubies in the publisher category. It's way easier to find all of the work.
Yeah, don't look for Warlock. That was an error. Don't look for that.
And so, no, it's been such a great time having you on today, talking about British OSR, talking about your designs. Hopefully people have been able to learn something, take something away. If you are a designer out there and you want to come on sometime, talk about your game, talk about a project you have, I would love to have you on. Prestige Class is all about just sitting down with designers and cracking into the work that they do. Usually there's one core question that I'm interested in, but we'll talk about any number of things along with that. Again, I want to encourage you all, if you have not yet, to go check out the work that Fire Ruby Design is doing. Keep an eye on Blackoath also. They're putting out some absolutely gorgeous resources and games. We'll at some point in the future have a polished review of Warlock up on the channel also too. But we also don't think that here on Plus One that content creators should have to pay to have their games covered, but we also have a cost. We have a team that I pay to help put together videos, graphics, other stuff like that. If you want to help support the work that we do and help support a diverse team, this money doesn't actually go to me. It helps me pay the people who help create the content for the channel, our editor, our graphic designer, and hopefully our actual play people in the long term also too. You can go to coffee.com, co-fi.com/plus1exp, become a content champion, get access to some extra goodies and bonuses that we're going to start kicking out next month. So if you're so inclined, please go do that. Also, feel free to follow us on social media at +1exp. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope, our desire is to help designers find great players who love their games and help players find great designers whose games they can love. And if you come back tomorrow, we've got another interview with another designer coming up about their system changing stars. We've got Pat here on the stream. They are going to be an absolute joy to talk to. We also are trying to, this is nothing against Greg or myself, trying to extend the amount of people we're interviewing who are people of color, who are, Black, Asian, Native, Indigenous people who are designers, also too, disabled community, increased gender diversity on the interviews and designers who are doing it. So if you are a designer who fits those categories, please let us know when you reach out. Also, if you know someone who you think would be a great designer who's in one of those categories, please let us know. The number one thing is that people need to know something is a safe space to come and ask and be asked questions, and that it's going to be embrace their work and want to share their work enthusiastically. And as much as I love talking to other white dudes, I love also talking to other people who are not white dudes. And so please feel free to suggest designers. If you are a designer who falls into any of those categories, know that we would be excited to share your games with everybody, because all those stories, all those games, all those things matter to us. And so please just let us know. With that said, this has been Prestige Class with Greg Saunders talking about British OSR and the Black edition of Warlock. And until next time, class is dismissed.